Hey crafty friends, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. Have you seen the new Timholtz A5 embossing folders? In this video, I'm showing you how to use them to make not one, but multiple cards. Because of their size, you can get multiple cards from just one embossed panel. Talk about crafty value. But I'm not going to stop at simple dry embossing. I'm going to show you a gorgeous technique using heat embossing and distress spray inks to create a truly one-of-a-kind background. Whether you like to keep things simple and elegant with a monochromatic color scheme, or you love going bold with vibrant color blends, this technique is super versatile and easy to customize. So grab your embossing folders, heat embossing supplies, and some distress inks, and let's get inky and inspired. As always, please check your stash for similar items when it comes to the supplies I'm using. If you are interested in any of the products I'm using in this video, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. When you shop through those links, and whether you purchase that exact item or something else entirely, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. Now let's get into the making. So the supplies I'm going to be working with for this video include the new Timholtz embossing folders. So these are the 3D embossing folders that are A5 size, so that's 5 7/8 by 8 1/4 inches, so it's very large. There are 5 designs that came out. This is just one of them, and these patterns are the exact pattern of the smaller original designs, and what they've done is just scaled them to this larger A5 size. Along with the embossing folder, I'm also going to be working with a couple of die sets. So I've got the Bloom die set, and I'm also using the Garden Greens die set. So if you don't have these, some other options could be just some large floral dies, such as these ones here. This is brushstroke number 2, brushstroke number 3, and I think this one's brushstroke number 1. But probably most of you have some floral dye that's got some different layers to it. And then also just some sort of greenery dye. So if you use these dyes, you could just use what's in the die set with them and not even have to worry about this one. So definitely some options for you there. I've got a sentiment set that I'm going to be using. This is the Typewriter Adventure Sentiments from Spellbinders. And of course, any sentiment stamp set would work. And then I'm also going to be using the Simon Hurley typewriter background stamp to do some stamping as well. The papers I'm going to be working with are distress watercolor cardstock. You can use any kind of paper that you have that can handle inks and sprays, so something that can handle water. And then I'm also using the black craft stock, and this is included in one of the paper packs from Tim, and I don't know. I use this paper all the time. I don't know why, but I just absolutely love it. And the craft stock is just craft paper, and it's got a color printed on the top, and this just happens to be black. And I'm also going to be using a sanding disc, but you could just use any kind of fine grit sandpaper will work. And then as far as the mediums go, I'm going to be working with Distress Oxide ink and Scorched Timber. And then I've got some Distress Oxide sprays in Speckled Egg, Uncharted Mariner, Brushed Corduroy, and Lost Shadow. You could do this technique with regular distress inks if you don't have the oxide, so it can go either way. I'm going to also be doing some heat embossing, so you're going to need some sort of embossing ink, and then either white or clear embossing powder. And then for the stamping, you can use any kind of a black ink. I used the Black Soot Archival ink, and then also the VersaFine Clair ink in Nocturne. I've got a piece of the Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I've cut it to 6 by 8.5 inches, which is the size of the inside of the embossing folder. And then I'm going to be working on the smooth side of the cardstock, but you could work on either side for this technique. And then you're going to take the embossing folder, and you're going to want to rub your hands over, and you're going to want to find the side where the pattern is raised. And you'll notice one side is raised and then the other side is not. So it's kind of like the design is like pressed into the folder, and the other side it's raised above the folder. And then what you're going to do is take your embossing ink and you're going to rub it just very lightly over the raised side of the embossing folder. So don't press, don't push it down. You're just rubbing it lightly over the surface. And you get good coverage. And if you notice, like if you've got any areas where it's more flat here, like this one, and you happen to get a little bit of the ink down in there, you can kind of wipe some of that off, but we can also work around that in the next step if we need to. Because this ink is pretty sticky, so the powder is probably still going to stick to those areas. But again, like I said, you're trying not to push, you're just trying to rub it very lightly over the surface. And then next you're going to take your paper, and if you'd like, you can spritz it with a little bit of water just to help it emboss a little better. So I'm going to spritz that with just a little bit of water off camera here. Just a few spritzes. And then you've got your ink side, so you're going to want to place your paper on the folder with the side you're working on down onto the inked background. And you want to just carefully place that in there. You want to make sure you leave a little bit of space. You don't want to jam the paper all the way up into the fold. Otherwise it's not going to fit through the die cutting machine. So you want to leave a little bit of a gap there. And then you're just going to fold that down and then run this through your die cutting machine. So now we've got our embossed paper. So I'm going to lift up the embossing folder and remove our embossed paper, and like normally this is the side that you would use, but we're going to be working on this side, so this is the side that you put down onto the ink. And then now you're going to take some white embossing powder. You could also use clear if you're working on white cardstock, and you're going to sprinkle that over the surface and then just tap that around and get a good coverage of the powder everywhere. So if you look closely, you can see some of the flat raised areas that have some powder on them. I don't want that on there, so I'm just going to take a small little paintbrush and just kind of brush off any of those areas where I don't want the powder. Now it doesn't have to be perfect because we are kind of going for a distressed effect with this look. So once you get all that powder brushed off, then you can just return that excess powder back to the jar. And then you're going to use your heat embossing gun to melt the powder here. Just make sure before you start blowing the heat gun over the surface of the powder, just make sure that you give the heat gun 10 to 15 seconds to warm up completely, and then you won't blow off quite so much of the powder. If you find that you are getting a lot of the powder coming off, it's possible that your ink pad is just not juicy enough and you're not getting enough ink on there, because embossing ink by nature is sticky, and that is what helps the powder stick to it. All right, so now our panel is fully heat embossed and it's time to move on to the next step. So now that you're finished with the heat embossing, we're going to take the paper and place it into a splat box or cardboard box if you like. I just like to work in the splat box because it contains the spray from getting everywhere, and we're going to be using the Distress Oxide Spray in Lost Shadow. You could also do this with any spray ink that you like. The only one I wouldn't recommend is the mica stains, because we're going to be doing some ink smooshing next. The inks may or may not show up on top of the mica stain because it's so opaque. And then you just want to make sure you give this a good shake and get all of that mixed in really well. That'll just kind of help minimize clogging. Then we're just going to give this a good coverage. This is a really light color, so it's not going to show up, you know, real dark or anything, which is kind of the idea. And then spritz that with a little water. And now I'm just going to dry that with my heat tool. As you're drying, you might notice that some areas aren't drying, and that is because the embossing powder is acting as a resist. So then the spray is only sticking to the paper that doesn't have embossing powder on it. So then once you're finished drying the paper, because there are areas where the ink is on top of the embossed areas, that ink is never going to dry. You're going to be able to wipe that off. It's not going to dry because that embossing powder is acting as a resist. And so then what you can do is just take a clean cloth and maybe just give it a little spritz of water. It doesn't need to be wet, but just slightly damp. And then you can just kind of rub it over the surface and lift off any of the areas of ink that are on top of the embossed sections, just to get that off of there, because like I said, it's not going to dry. So I'm just going to wipe that off. Well, now we're going to do some ink smooshing with Distress Oxide sprays. Now you could also do this with the inks pads or Distress inks, but I wanted to use the sprays. And again, you just want to make sure you give these a good shake. Get them mixed up well. And you want to make sure you're working on some sort of non-stick craft. And then what I'm going to do is just spray some of this, kind of holding it close to the paper so it doesn't get too much of everywhere. But you're going to get some off spray around this, so just kind of keep that in mind. And kind of think about how big your paper is with this. So you want to make sure you're got enough ink to cover everything, and then we're going to give that a good spritz. And then you're just going to smush your paper into that ink. And voila. So if you want to get this blended a little bit more, you can add a little bit more ink splatters. If there's some areas that you're like, oh, I don't think I got enough ink on there, you can always kind of smush it back in if you like. And then you just set this to the side and let it dry. So we have this leftover ink, and that can still be used. And I wanted to also share with you that the technique that I've showed you with the embossing folder, where you inked the raised side of the embossing folder, you can do that same technique and ink the debossed side, so the other side of the embossing folder. And that's what I've done here. So this is normally the side that you think of that you would use when you're embossing. So you've got your embossing folder, the design's printed on the front, and when you open it up, what I did was I inked the top of the embossing folder. So this one is the one that is more flat. This is the one that we did the first time around. And then I just placed my paper in here with the side I was working on facing up. And then I ran that through my die cutting machine, added the embossing powder, and then heat embossed it. And instead of spraying this one with the Lost Shadow Distress ink, I'm just going to ink smush this into the paper. And yes, the back side of this is the same as we did earlier. I'm just saving paper to show you some options here. So if this is needing to be kind of reactivated, you could add little spritz of water. And then again, you're just going to ink smush that into the ink that's on your craft mat. So not a lot of ink here, so let's get this moving a little bit more. And let's do that again. So there won't be as much ink on that second go around. And with the embossing on that more flat side of the embossing folder, you're going to notice that you've got these areas here that's resisting the spray ink because that's where the embossing powder is melted. And like I said earlier, that's a resist. So the ink will only stick to the areas that don't have the embossing powder. If you've got areas and you know, like, oh, there's no embossing powder there, you could also kind of do a little finger painting, which is always something I do in this situation where I know I've got some areas that I didn't quite get ink on, and I want to, you know, maybe add a color into that area that's not there. But then there's some areas here where there's not going to be a lot of color because there's embossing powder there. And then, yeah, so then here we can just set this to the side to dry, or dry it with your heat tool. And then now at this point I am going to clean up this leftover ink. And then again, like as with the other panel, there's going to be areas where that ink is not going to dry because it's on that embossing powder that's resisting the ink. So if you just want to dry this until the paper is dry, and then once that paper is dry, and just take a slightly damp rag and then just kind of go over and wipe up any areas that either aren't dry that you can, you know, really see, and then just kind of lightly wipe over the surface so that some of that ink is just not going to dry because it's being resisted by the embossing powder. And so there is our finished backgrounds. And so that same thing holds true with the initial background where you're making. You know, you give that a dry until the paper's dry. And then once the paper's dry, again, just kind of take that slightly damp cloth and you can just kind of wipe over the background, just lifting off any of that excess ink that's not going to dry. And there you have it. So there are our two panels that we've created. And now, as you can see, these are quite large, so you can get multiple card backgrounds out of these. So in my mind, you've got 4 cards here ready to go. All you have to do is cut these panels in half and then trim them down to whatever size you want for your card front. So when it comes to card sizes, there's kind of, it gets a little bit confusing, but what I like to do is kind of create little card front templates so that I know what size I am working with. And as you can see, this is A5. This is the size of these embossing folders, which is 5 7/8 by 8 1/4. And that is kind of a UK size for paper. Now that is a large card, but if you are into big cards, then you would use this panel as is, just trim off the edges and maybe mat it onto something. And then the next size is like a larger US standard size is 5 by 7, so obviously you can only get 1 card panel out of this. I guess you could possibly cut this in half and then add some layers to it to get to 5 by 7, so that's an option. You get 2 out of there. Then A6, which is 4.5 by 6 1/4. You are going to be able to get 2 card fronts out of there. You're going to need to layer, and then I also have little measurements on here for what I like to, my sizes that I like to use for layering, and then so that just gives you a small little border, but you could adjust that as you desire. But you would be able to get 2 panels out of that for A6. Then there is also an A6 UK size, which is 4 1/8 by 5 7/8, and you can definitely get 2 panels out of there for that one. And then the kind of standard US size card that I usually make is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then that one obviously you can create 2 panels with that as well. For this card samples I'm going to be doing today, I'm going to be doing this larger A6 size, so 4.5 by 6.25 inches. And so I'm going to trim these panels down to layer a little, so they'll probably be a little bit smaller than this because I've made this 6 inches wide, and I'm going to trim off this edging here a little bit. So, but yeah, so we'll still get 2 card panels out of this. So I'd cut this at 8.5 inches, so I'm going to cut it down to 4.25 inches. And so that would give me a nice layer onto there. Like I said, I think, well, that edging's not bad, so maybe I would leave that on there. I think I will, and then just use it as is there. And then I would just do the same thing for this one, just cut it in half. But like this one has a little more pronounced edging, so I'm going to show you with that one. You know, you cut it down to in half basically, so I cut it at 4.25 inches, and then I'm just going to trim off that about 1/8 of an inch on each side. So that'll get it down to 5 3/4. And I'm going to cut another 1/4 inch off on the width. And so as you can see, that just still gives you that nice layered border. And probably what I would do here is add another layer behind this. So like in between this layer and that layer, just add one more that's like 1/8 of an inch larger. And that'll just give you a double mat, which would be really pretty. Or you could stay with this larger mat, which is actually kind of pretty. So as you can see, with one embossing folder, you can get 2 card fronts. And by using leftover ink and applying the embossing ink to the other side of the embossing folder, you can get 4 card panels. This is just a great way to stretch your tool, especially if you do end up with any of these larger A5 size embossing folders. So off camera, I did a bunch of die cutting using the Blossom die set and the Garden Greens die set. And I cut some of the layers of the flower from some black craft stock, and one of the leaves from the black craft stock. And then I cut most of the layers of the flower, other than that solid layer, from some distressed watercolor cardstock. And one of the things I'm going to do with the black craft stock is do a little bit of sanding to give it just a little bit of a vintage aged effect. And to do that, I like to put the die cut back into the paper I cut it from. And then I've got a sanding disc from Ranger, which is just a fine grit sandpaper, and then a scrap of packaging, and just to help protect my work surface. And then I'm just going to lightly rub over the die cut with the sandpaper, and this will reveal some of that craft core of the paper. So the back side of this paper is craft colored, and it's got a black printed on top of it. And if you don't have this exact paper, there's other papers out there that you could do something similar with. You could even do this with paper that has a white core to give you kind of that distressed effect. So then you just remove it from the negative there, and then that's what it looks like sanded versus solid. So you don't have to do the sanding if you don't want to. You could certainly skip that part. So by placing that die back into that negative section that it was cut out of, that just helps you minimize tearing or ripping, especially these like really detailed little die cuts. So just kind of helps, gives you a little something to hold on to. But I still like to make sure I kind of hold tightly on that die cut and then kind of pull away from the center so that I'm not running the risk of tearing it, because these little die cuts are so delicate. Then I'm also going to do that same thing with the flower and just kind of sand the edges of it with the sanding disc again, just to kind of give it a little bit of a distressed effect. So as you can see, that side sanded, and then this side I I didn't sand, so you can kind of see the difference there. So the next thing I'm going to do is take these kind of more solid, so this is like the next layer of the flower, and the like more solid leaf dye, and we're going to add some stamping detail to that. And for that I'm using the Simon Hurley background typewriter stamp. I'm just going to place that here in my platform, and then it's so big that I can stamp some of these, you know, just all at once here. So there you go. And I want to kind of hold these in place a little bit so they don't move. So I'm just going to put a little bit of temporary adhesive on the back side of these die cuts to help hold them in place so they don't shift if I need to stamp more than once. And then I'm just going to stamp these with the black ink. You could use any kind of ink for this. And then I'm just going to stamp that another time just to get a little darker. There we go. You can stamp that again if you wanted. It's kind of up to you on how dark you want that. And then I'm just going to repeat that with all of the solid leaves and flower image. And when you die cut the flowers, no matter which one layer you're cutting, you end up with this kind of centerpiece. So I've got and then I'm just going to spray those with the brushed corduroy. And give that a quick dry. Now for the little detail pieces on the flowers and then the more solid layer of the flowers, I'm going to spray those with the Uncharted Mariner. And then give that a quick dry. And then lastly, this top layer of the flower center, I'm going to add some speckled egg. And then from there, once you get all your pieces inked and sanded and sprayed and stamped, then it's just a matter of assembling the flower and adhering it to the card front. Before we go, here's a look at the completed cards so you can really see how that heat embossing and spray inks came together with the embossing folder. I'm also sharing a monochromatic example to show you how beautiful this technique looks when you keep things simple and tone on tone. And that's a wrap on using the new Timholtz A5 embossing folders to create multiple cards. I hope this gave you some fun ideas for stretching your supplies and trying out a new technique or two. And whether you have these A5 embossing folders or just regular embossing folders, these techniques can be done with either one. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.